I am so incredibly blessed to be with you this morning and all weekend. I have had an amazing weekend with amazing people here at Vista Grande, and I am so thankful for this time together with you. I return later today to Denver with a heart full of appreciation and gratitude to you. To begin with, I would like to start with my personal land acknowledgement. This sermon was written in Denver, Colorado, on land that was traveled by the Cheyenne, Kiowa, Ute, and Arapaho indigenous people for centuries. I acknowledge this land and this place is this ancestral home where the people hunted and traveled. It is important for me to acknowledge the land as a Christian pastor, and also as an immigrant, and honor the original inhabitants. As an activist, I pledge myself to the work of disrupting systems of oppression that led to the disposition of indigenous people from the land and have continued to deny their rights to self-determination. The Cheyenne, Kiowa, Ute, and Arapaho people are not a people of the past. They are a people of the present. I and maybe many of you grew up with this morning's text of Jesus's great commandment to love one another. I'm sure I may have been very confused as a child hearing my parents talk about this text. I imagine saying, well, of course, I love my friends. What more is there? But I went to a white elementary school in Tenafly, New Jersey, a very white suburb of New York City. And I never went to school with a child of color until I moved to Flagstaff, Arizona in my junior year of high school, where white high schoolers were fewer in a school of Navajo, Hopi, Black, and Latino and Latina kids. My locker mate was LaDonna Williams from Tuba City, Arizona, from the Navajo Nation. A command, not just a simple ask, not just an invitation, not a plea, a command. Webster's defines command as give an authoritative order. We don't hear Jesus giving authoritative orders very often. The word command tells us this: it's important. In the context of our sacred text, Jesus is gathered with the disciples only days before his betrayal. This is the time that we call Holy Week, but no one sees this yet. No one knows of this yet. But these disciples, friends, and believers know on this day is this: everyone is gathered in Jerusalem. Jesus has just washed the feet of the disciples, and they are gathered together as friends are and friends do. What if you were there and you heard this commandment from Jesus, this authoritative order to love one another? And as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. I believe that Jesus' command is not for the neighbor sitting in the pew in the four walls of church. I understand this love as not being the love of family and friend, but of stranger and neighbor. Because this is how others will see you and me outside of church, living out what Jesus is commanding us to do in the secular world, how we show up, speak up with others that may be different than me, different than you, how to be justice to each other. This is how they will know we are Christians, by our name. To be seen in faith, to be seen welcoming those who are different than you and me, who speak different languages than you and me, who come from different places from you and me. So Jesus weaves this commandment and a call that says, people will know you are of my flock because this is what love looks like. This is what faith looks like. This is what a just world looks like. A day later, he's betrayed by his friend Judas, taken away, brought before Pilate, forced to carry a cross through Jerusalem, is crucified, and dies a painful and violent death. Church, we discover from those first century Christians celebrating difference, celebrating the difference of language is loving your neighbor on the day we call Pentecost. I really wish we spent much more time listening to and understanding the day the Holy Spirit blew in on those gathered in the church with a big C begins. We spend only one Sunday of the year, but those gathered were thousands of people who spoke many languages and came from many parts of the world, were diverse, and in that moment, our church was born. Let us not forget our church is born out of a celebration of diversity. How can we live into the commandment and call into the 21st century in our Rocky Mountain Conference of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah as individuals and as communities of faith in towns and villages where there are complicated racial justice histories, even churches that have complicated racial justice histories? We speak up and show up and welcome the diverse and those who may look very different than you and me. Maybe you have a complicated racial justice history. I know I do. And I invite all white people to have a complicated racial justice history and claim that of their own. Whether you call it moral courage or spiritual courage, speaking up, standing up, and showing up, as Mallory referenced, as a sign of solidarity with people of color is not just an exercise in the four walls of Inside Church. It is the outside of the four walls. Our faith requires us to love our neighbors, but you may ask, well, how do we do this? How do white people decenter whiteness in a community that is mostly white? How do we dismantle white silence as individuals together and as a group of faithful individual Christians in community? And maybe for some, more importantly, why should we? Well, first, the world is changing and will continue to change. And those who believe in Jesus' teaching know that this act of loving your neighbor or a stranger, of being in church, doesn't just end in these four walls, but continues into the grocery store, at school, at work, on Facebook, on vacation. That is where religious faithfulness resides as well. While you and I may live in almost exclusively white neighborhoods and towns, most likely our children and grandchildren don't, if they live in multicultural and diverse neighborhoods in towns all across the American West and beyond. Second, white Christians have been historically pretty silent around issues of racial justice. You can name it as fear. White author Robin DiAngelo describes it as white fragility. As a whole, white people have not spoken up or stood up or showed up with people of color at moments in history, or even, honestly, maybe even at the Thanksgiving table. We've been very silent when it comes to racial justice in America. White Christians have not heeded the love your neighbor commandment well. White Christians failed miserably when Jewish people tried to come to America by boat and we turned them away. White Christians were silent as a whole when Japanese Americans were forced from their homes after Pearl Harbor and sent to internment camps that were here in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And you may say, well, those decisions were made by white people of power in Washington, D.C. And I would add, who also went to church. With the exception of a few loud abolitionists in the 19th century, faithful white Christians did not work towards ending the enslavement of Black people, men, women, and children. Abolitionist John Brown did. Congregationalist Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1952 that shined a light on slavery in the South. a complicated novel for many, but she did. As a US soldier at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, Silas Sewell disobeyed orders to engage in the massacre, watched 150 Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho women, children, and elders be horrifically murdered. He then wrote letters about what he saw, forced a congressional inquiry against his commander, John Chivington. He was assassinated on the streets of Denver in April 1865 for speaking his truth to power. A few short years earlier, Silas had escorted formerly enslaved people to freedom near Lawrence, Kansas, along the Underground Railroad. His family home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. While we celebrate much in the United Church of Christ, we have a very complicated and messy racial justice history too. We have historically been participants in some events that were not very Christian and not spoken of frequently or at all. Here are just a few. Congregationalist missionaries arrived in 1820, and their descendants in the Hawaiian Evangelical Conference Association, which later became the Hawaii Conference, contributed to overthrowing Queen Pakalukekaliani in 1893. A public apology happened almost 100 years later at the 1991 General Synod, with no mention of asking for forgiveness. New England Congregationalists saw an opportunity to missionize the Black South after the American Civil War ended, and through the church's American Missionary Association, brought Jesus of the Congregationalists to the formerly enslaved people of the South. These families had already found a Christian faith in the stories of liberation, Jesus the healer, interwoven with the stories of survival found in the spirituals. Their faith looked very different than the white New England congregations. Over time, the missionaries built schools and universities, but by 1920, the Missionary Association and the Congregationalists abandoned the Black South. In 2007, of the more than 500 missionary schools that had been built, only 6 were still related to the UCC. And finally, there is very little evidence of UCC pastors en masse showing up in the streets of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Occasionally, one can read in an obituary of a white pastor who marched, but it is rare. And I discovered that this spring by reading the obituary of Rob Lapp, who recently died and was one of our ministers in the conference who participated in the civil rights movement and marched. Look for historical references in our various UCC publications, and there is literally nothing. Look at our website and you will find nothing much. The ongoing work of naming, speaking, and writing about our UCC racial justice history, especially with people of color, ensures that it is not lost history, or more importantly, an intentional hidden history. What I have come to understand in the last 3 years of study is to challenge some of the values and principles of our denominational identity. Historically, are we say who we are? And on a more contemporary spin, we are a progressive denomination as we say we are? Are we? I always haven't known how to stand up, show up, and speak up with people of color. Maybe that is you too. I had fear of saying the wrong thing. It is one of the symptoms of white fragility that Robin DiAngelo writes about. I ultimately overcame my fear by surrounding myself in community with others who wanted to say something too. You may think that it's easy to be silent, that it's easy not to rock the boat, that it's easy to not challenge systems of injustices or oppression that exist in our country. It's easy not to show up at a protest in Colorado Springs or carry a sign or lend a voice. But from my own personal experiences, I suggest that it's not that easy. If we are truly to follow Jesus' commandment and call to us, it's not easy at all to be silent. and stay silent. There are white ancestors of faith and resistance who can inspire a generation of activists. There are friends who can help us find a voice of justice, which is also love for together and another. We have a minister here who has such a big heart of justice. You have a faith community here to surround you, love you, support you, to discover a deeper justice-filled voice, to discover a deeper justice-filled communal voice with the people of Colorado Springs in the Rocky Mountain Conference of the UCC. We are not meant to do this work alone as individuals. I know you know that. We need each other to build up a new way, build a new world. As I close, Dr. Vincent Harding, who wrote speeches for and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, had already retired from Iliff School of Theology when I showed up in 2006. But he taught students a freedom song that I'd like to teach to you today. I'm wondering if we can make sure that the lyrics of our call to worship pop up here. Singing freedom songs together is an act of resistance. In fact, we spoke it in our call to worship this morning. It goes to the tune of "We Are Climbing Jacob's." Church, let us sing that sacred promise over and over again. A sacred covenant to help each other, to love your neighbor in ways that will challenge us, move us, inspire us, make us feel weary, help us find courage, make us at times uncomfortable. Let's build a new world together and prayerfully help each other to be who we are called to be, the disciples that Jesus continues to command us to be. And all the people said.